The Brown Pundits Browncast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Brown Pundits Browncast. This is the 13th episode in our series of episodes on the history of the Indian subcontinent. In this episode, I am joined by Shrikanth, Mukunda, Gaurav, and hopefully Omar Saab at a later point to talk about the history of southern India from 1100 AD to 1400 AD. Welcome to the episode, gentlemen.
Hey, Gaurav.
What's up, everybody? Hello.
Right. So good to have you guys back. Shrikanth, let's start with what does the political map of the subcontinent look like? It's 1100 AD. The Cholas are at the fag end of their reign. What does the political map look like? Who are the dynasties ruling the southern part of the subcontinent?
Sure. So I think when we look at this period from 1100 AD to 1400 AD, I think we probably need to look at each of the 3 centuries separately, right? So between 1100 and 1200, the powers that we discussed in one of our previous episodes, they were still pretty dominant, right? So throughout the 12th century, from about 1100 to 1200, we had the dominant powers in the south being the Cholas in the Tamil country and the Western Chalukyas, the Kalyani Chalukyas in the north, right? And when we look at the political interplay during this period, it's basically, you can think of the 12th century as basically the conflict between the Cholas and the Chalukyas. And they were still pretty dominant even right till the end of the 12th century, right? It was towards the end of the 12th century that we started seeing the cracks in the edifice of both Cholas and Chalukyas, right? And we saw both powers declining in influence, particularly the Chalukyas. And when by the early 13th century, we had 4 powers emerging, which basically replaced these 2 powers, right? And those were the Kakatiyas in the Andhra territory, Yadavas, who were originally feudatories of the Chalukyas, but they emerged as an independent power in what is Maharashtra today. The Yadavas are also known as Seunas, I think, in inscriptions. Then you had the Pandya power in the deep south, and Hoysalas in southern Karnataka and western Tamil Nadu, right? And these 4 powers basically dominated much of the 13th century, from 1200 to 1300, right? And it's towards the end of the 13th century that you start seeing these kingdoms reacting to the political developments in the north, right? So in late 13th, early 14th century, we see the raids from the north, most notably that of Malik Kafur, who was one of the generals of Alauddin Khilji, right? And these incursions and these raids clearly weakened all 4 of these empires that we mentioned, right? The Kakatiyas, Yadavas, Pandyas, and Hoysalas. And by the time we reach about 1330 or so, all 4 powers basically declined. And much of the Deccan was actually part of the Tughlaq empire, right? And then we talk about the last phase of this period, from about 1330 till 1400. During that period, we see the emergence of strong Hindu resistance down south against the Delhi Sultanate, right? So in some parts of the south, you had independent Muslim powers emerging, like the Madurai Sultanate and the Bahmani Kingdom. And then you also had the rise of Vijayanagara as a major force, right, which basically stalled the growth of Islamic polity down south around 1340 or so, right? And we see the consolidation of Vijayanagara Empire between 1340 till about 1400, right? So that's how I would think of this period, right? So you have the 12th century, 1100 to 1200, when basically the Cholas and Chalukyas were still pretty dominant, and then the 13th century, where these 2 powers kind of declined and they were replaced by 4 powers, which I discussed. And then the last of at the tail end of this period, you had the interaction with the Delhi Sultanate and the emergence of Vijayanagara as the dominant power in the Deccan. Right?
Shrikanth, what is our source of information when we talk about this period? Who are the writers? What are the scriptures, inscriptions? Yeah. How do we know about this age?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, because when we discussed the previous period in one of our earlier episodes in the context of southern India, right, 500 to 1100 AD, we were relying pretty heavily on inscriptional evidence, right? But that is not necessarily the case when we talk about this period from 1100 to 1400. You still have lots and lots of inscriptions, but then the literary evidence becomes increasingly reliable, right? So let's discuss the inscriptional evidence first. So I can give you an example of one inscription, which is of a historical nature. This is an inscription found in Tiruvahindrapuram in northern Tamil Nadu. It is one of those rare inscriptions which is not a land grant or a legal contract, right? Instead, this particular inscription is purely historical in nature. It discusses the fortunes of Rajaraja III, who was one of the late Chola kings, right? This is an early 13th century inscription. It discusses his numerous problems in his administration, his tussles with a local Varniyar chieftain, his conflicts with the Pandyas, and how he has to rely on Hoysalas to bail him out. So this is an example of a fairly elaborate inscription which illuminates much of the late Chola period, right? But as I mentioned, during this period, there's abundant literary evidence as well, which is somewhat more reliable than what you saw in the earlier period. For the 14th century, we actually have a lot of literary evidence from the Muslim sources, right? Barani, the great political thinker of the Delhi Sultanate, we see a lot of information from his writings. And then we also have retrospective histories written by Muslims from a later period, like Ferishta, who I think belongs to 16th century or so, but he's relying on sources that he has access to relate the early history of the Delhi Sultanate and its engagements in the Deccan, right? Then we also have lots of foreign travelogues in this period, most notably Marco Polo, who is very, very famous. He visited India in late 13th century while en route from China to Persia. He stopped on the way to Persia in southern India, I think, and he spent quite some time in the deep south. Then we have Chao Jukwa, a Chinese trade inspector who also spent significant time in the Pandya territory. And then in the mid-14th century, you have another traveler from Morocco, Ibn Battuta, who is an important source on the Madurai Sultanate, right? Much of what we know about the Madurai Sultanate is from Ibn Battuta. There's also Futuh us-Salatin, a work by Abdul Malik Ismay in Persian on the Bahmani Empire. So that's an important, it's probably the only contemporary source that exists on the Bahmani Empire. So lots of literary evidence from these foreign travelers. And then we also have literary evidence from the Hindu sources, an example being the Chalukya king Someshwara III's encyclopedic work, Manasollasa, which is very famous, which discusses many things regarding culture, cuisine, art in that part of the South in early 13th century, right? And we have eulogies written which are of quasi-historical nature, like the poem Madhura Vijayam by Ganga Devi, who was one of the queens of the princesses of the Vijayanagara Empire. It's an interesting source which discusses her husband's triumph over the Madurai Sultanate, right? Kumara Kampanna's triumph over the Madurai Sultanate. And then we also have temple histories emerging in this period. One example being Shrirangam's Koil Alagu, right? It's an important source of the Srirangam temple's history, and it discusses how the temple was ransacked twice by Malik Kafur and later by Ulugh Khan, right? That's also an interesting source, right? So I think we have broadly covered the sources. So to summarize, I would say literary evidence is pretty rich in this period, unlike the earlier periods, in addition to the abundant inscriptional evidence.
Right. No, this is helpful. Mukunda, have you read anything about the various sources of information of this period of this era?
Yeah, I mean, I have, but some of these are things like the hagiographies of various saints and philosophers written. I mean, some of them were written at the tail end of this period, and others were written after this period, right? You have like stories about, for example, like we'll talk about later, Vedantishka's perspective on the invasions of Srirangam and how that affected the entire Sri Vaishnava community and the larger, the community down there. And then you have also with conversations about Madhvacharya and his interactions with the Muslims that had just come into the region at the time. And then you have, the earlier part of the 11th century, roughly, like when you have like Ramanuja, and then probably Vidyaranya is a little after that, but like you don't get much of the Islamic influence at that point yet, because I don't think it fully had become infiltrated, or I don't even want to use that word. I think that's a very loaded word, but it had become, I guess, influence in that area at that point. I think the influence actually started probably in the mid 12th to beginning of the 13th century, where you start a large amount of the Islamic influence in the region. So yeah, I've read some of the sources, not the political side, honestly. My knowledge of the political side outside of some of the Vijayanagara stuff, which was also again at the tail end of this, right? That Vijayanagara started roughly around the late 12th to early 13th century, and then went into the 14th century and onwards. But yeah, the Hoysalas, we have some information on the Hoysalas again. When you read the hagiographies of Ramanuja converting Vishnuvardhan over to Vaishnavism from Jainism, and so you have some of this information that exists there, but I haven't read a lot of the sources, honestly, in terms of the historical side. I've read much more of the philosophical hagiographies.
Sure. Shrikanth, what's the dynamic between the Cholas and the Western Chalukyas? Now we're talking 12th century. The Chola empires, this is pretty much the last century of the Chola empire. So what's this dynamic? What do we know about the end of the Chola dynasty and its dynamic with the Western Chalukyas?
Right. So if you go back to 1100, around that time, we had fairly strong monarchs, both on the Chola side as well as the Western Chalukya side, right? So we had, I think it was Kulothunga the first who was ruling the Chola empire at that time. And then on the Western Chalukya side, I think it was Vikramaditya the sixth, who was a very famous king. I think his court was adorned by luminaries like Vijnaneshwara, the great jurist, and also Bilhana, the poet, the Kashmiri poet, right? So I think both powers were fairly stable and fairly powerful around that time, 1100. And then as much of the 12th century was basically a long tussle between the Western Chalukyas and the Cholas, right? And at that point, I think as we discussed in our earlier episode, the Cholas had been united with the Vengi Chalukyas of the East into a single crown, right? So much of southern Andhra was actually controlled by the Cholas at that time, whereas the Western Chalukyas were more dominant in northern Karnataka and what's Maharashtra today, right? I'm not super close to the details with respect to this period in terms of what battle was fought when and all of that, right? And I think those who are interested can read it up in history books. But it's fair to say that there was a long-standing tussle between these two empires. And when you look at other powers like, say, Hoysalas, they were basically subordinate to the Western Chalukyas. They were not independent. They were not yet an independent power in the 1100s, right? But around by the time we reached the mid 1100s, you had kings like Vishnuvardhana emerging in the Hoysala region, who were still subordinate to the Western Chalukyas, but they were becoming increasingly powerful. So by the time you reach the late 12th century, Hoysalas had basically declared their independence, and by then I think even the Yadavas on the north, the Sionas rather, right? They had also declared their independence. So the Western Chalukya Empire basically disintegrated by the time we reach the end of the 12th century, right? The Chola power, I think, lasted a bit longer than the Western Chalukyas. It continued till the 13th century. So even in early 13th century, the Cholas were still a power, but they were on the decline. I think the Hoysalas had become independent by then, and then the Pandyas were increasingly influential in southern Tamil Nadu and the Malabar region, right? So, and I think the source that I mentioned, the inscription in Tiruvahindrapuram, that is an interesting source on late Chola history, right? Especially the reign of Rajaraja III was, I think, the penultimate Chola king, right? That's an interesting source which outlines how he has to grapple with upstart powers like the Pandyas in the south, and also some Kadava chieftain, I forget his name, and somewhere in northern Tamil Nadu, if I'm not wrong, right? And he has to rely on Hoysalas to bail him out, to help him, right? So the Hoysalas often allied with the Cholas and helped them during their last years, right? But by the time we reach about mid 13th century, about 1230 or 1240 or so, I think the Cholas had pretty much reached their final stage. I think they had pretty much their decline was complete by then, right? So I hope that helps.
Yeah, what's happening in Kerala in this point of time? Which are the kingdoms, which are the dynasties that are dominating that part of the geography?
I think the Pandyas, who had a late resurgence in early 13th century, they were the dominant power in much of southern Tamil Nadu and Malabar, right? If I'm not wrong. The Pandyas were the major power at that time. In late 12th, much of 13th century, in fact. Yeah, in Kerala.
Right. Let's talk about Hoysalas. You mentioned they were part of the Western Chalukya kingdom. They were subordinate to the Western Chalukya kings. What do we know about Hoysalas? What are the origins of this dynasty? What is the geography where they dominated?
Yeah, so the Hoysalas were basically based in southern Karnataka, right? In what is Hassan today. So Dwara Samudra was their capital. I don't know what you call it. Is it Dwara Samudra or Dora Samudra? I don't know. It's spelled differently in different places. I think it is Dwara Samudra. That's the correct Sanskrit name. And today we know that place as Halebit. So Dora Samudra is basically Halebit, right? So Belur Halebit, that is the core Hoysala region. And it's very famous today for its exquisite temples. So they were based in that region, and they were, I think, primarily feudatories of the Western Chalukyas. I think in mid 12th century, the Hoysalas, who were originally Jain, they converted to Vaishnavism, and I think Mukunda just referred to that a few minutes back. Ramanuja, the great Vaishnava philosopher, he spent much of his later years in Karnataka, and he managed to convert Vishnuvardhan, the Hoysala chief, to Vaishnavism, right? So it was a conversion from Jainism to Vaishnavism. And somehow I think this change of religion had a major role to play in the Hoysala revival for whatever, I don't know if it's correlation or causation, but because post Vishnuvardhan, the Hoysalas became very dominant, right? And they declared their independence. They managed to shrug off the influence of the authority of the Western Chalukyas, and they became an independent power, with holding sway over much of southern central Karnataka and also western Tamil Nadu, right? And I think Hoysalas at one point, their power extended all the way up to Trichy, Srirangam, right? If I'm not wrong. Yeah.
Right.
It lasted pretty long too. So we're talking about Hoysalas emerging as an independent power in mid to late 12th century. And they were pretty dominant. They were probably the last of the southern powers to fall in mid 14th century. Right? I think the last Hoysala king was Veera Ballala III, who actually fought against the Madurai Sultanate, and it was a lost cause, right? He was killed in the battle, and that marked the end of Hoysala reign. So they lasted from mid 12th century till mid 14th century, a good 200 years, right? Yeah.
Right. What do we know about Kakatiyas?
The Kakatiyas are an interesting dynasty. So they were based in Telangana, right? And I think they were originally, I guess, in feudatories to the Western Chalukyas, very likely, right? But their emergence as an independent power was, I think, sometime towards the end of the 12th century, right? Around 1200 or so, right? And they managed to wrest much of the coastal Andhra as well from the Cholas, right? So I think the emergence of Kakatiyas as an independent power was pretty critical to the development of some kind of nationalism in the Telugu country, right, based on language, because they managed to bring together Telangana and coastal Andhra, right, the Godavari Krishna basin under a single power, right, and I think
that was
yeah.
I think that was I think that's right around the time period we're talking about, right? Because the Kakatiyas were roughly around since the 6th century, 7th century CE, and they were steadily but slowly growing in power over the time period. And Cynthia Talbot writes quite a bit about them in her book, both her book, Pre-Colonial India and India Before Europe, where she talks about
But I'm not super well read on the early history of the Kakatiya, so maybe their antecedents go back to the time you mentioned, right? But I think as an independent power, they emerged only towards the end of the 12th century. So that's when they became completely independent.
Yeah. No, that's correct. And that's right around the time that Marco Polo came into the region. Well, he came in into the tail end of the 12th century, early 13th century.
I think Marco Polo is a little later, a late 13th century. 1290s.
Yeah. 1290s, you're correct. Yeah, that's right. So he writes a lot about what's it called? Warangal? Warangal. And then Rudramadevi and a few other.
That's right.
And they made a movie about her. I think a few years ago with Anushka Shetty. It was a very Collywood version of that story. But it's very interesting how they described the kingdom of the Kakatiyas at that time. And it was interesting to say that they did very strongly associate. They're very strong Shaivites too, and to my recollection, and their independence again, I think, arose from the fact that they actually. It's actually interesting because this is what Cynthia Talbot writes about. This is, I believe she indicates they were actually of non-Kshatriya origin, so they were like Shudras.
Right. And they proudly declared that in many of their inscriptions.
Yes. And that's over time you see that become more and more prevalent. And she talks about in her book. And then by the time they become independent and become a larger empire to be reckoned with, they wear that badge on their sleeve, strongly. They claim their origins of the Shudra origin that took power of Kshatratva. And it's very I would say it is a narrative that kind of doesn't fit into what we currently think about the world of Varna and Jati that we currently talk about.
Right. And it's probably because of their relatively humble origins, right? That they did patronize the local language to a great extent, the Telugu language, right? And for the first time, you had both the Telangana region as well as the coastal Andhra region coming under a single power, right? Which provided an impetus to the development of Telugu culture. And I think it was during Kakatiya rule that the Mahabharata was translated in Telugu. I think it started before Kakatiya rule under Nanaya, and then it was completed by Tikkanna and Eranna, I think. So by the end of the Kakatiya rule, you had the translation of the great epic into Telugu. And this is the first time that you see a distinct Telugu literature emerging, right? So before 1100, there's really no literature. Before 1000 AD, in fact, there's no real literature in Telugu, right? Because when we had our previous episode, we basically spoke about Tamil literature and Kannada literature, right? So now we have this literary fervor developing in the Telugu region, and which happened very much under Kakatiya auspices, right? And the Kakatiyas, after their decline, and the Kakatiya decline was basically triggered by the Islamic invasions of Malik Kafur and Ulugh Khan, right? And after the Kakatiyas declined, they were replaced by another dynasty of Telugu origin, the Reddys of the same region of Telangana, right? You had Pralaya Vema Reddy and his successors, who actually managed to wrest back much of the control of the region from the Tughlaqs, right? So they continued to carry the torch lit by Kakatiyas, right? You could think of them as a continuation of the Kakatiya dynasty, in some ways.
Right. What about Pandyas? You mentioned that's the another dynasty that sees its revival in the 12th, 13th century.
Yeah, the Pandyas had, around forever, right? We discussed Pandyas even in one of our very early episodes in the Sangam period itself. And then the Pandyas had another revival around 7th, 8th century. So this was actually their second revival in the early 13th century, right? When they basically flourished at the expense of the Cholas, right? I don't know a lot, to be honest, about Pandya political history, but it's fair to say that they basically flourished in what was previously Chola territory, right? The Pandyas continued to be a major power throughout the 13th century till about early 14th century. Interestingly, what caused the decline of the Pandyas is dynastic confusion, right? So there was this, one of the Pandya kings towards the late 13th century, he had two sons. I think his elder son was through his legal wife and his younger son was through a mistress. And he actually passed on the kingdom to his illegitimate son, right? And this kind of enraged the elder son, whose name was, I think, Sundara Pandya. And Sundara Pandya in early 14th century, he was so very angry at his father's decision, I think, that he sought the help of Malik Kafur, who had come down from Delhi all the way till Dwarasamudra, the Hoysala capital, right? And he had just raided Halebid in early 14th century. And Sundara Pandya actually reached out to Malik Kafur and took his help to invade Madurai with the help of the Muslim forces, right? So his personal ambition came in the way of doing the right thing, right? So he actually took the support of a foreign power to reach his ends, to basically reclaim his kingdom, right? And Malik Kafur's invasion greatly weakened the Pandyas, and I don't think they ever recovered from that.
Yeah, I just to hop on that, I also think it's important to know that in this time period, like, we've discussed Pandyas, Cholas, not really even the Cheras, but all these especially these three ancient Tamil dynasties didn't ever go away, right? Like, even though they might be become vassals or become smaller nations, they still remained. The Cheras still remained in this period. Cholas did, Pandyas did. They were never extinguished. So these dynasties, I think, is interesting because they do kind of somewhat pop up in minor kingdoms here and there. So it's not. So it's very. It was never as in like when there was a victory, it was a decimation of the entire side. It didn't seem to be that case. It seemed to be the case that you take the victory and then you take over the empire, and then you make the loser a vassal of sorts, and that they can maybe never come out of that. So all these kingdoms, the Hoysalas still existed, I think, until roughly the 17th, 18th century. And they had minor kingdoms here and there, from my understanding. And that goes for quite a bit of these dynasties that have existed. I mean, like, I actually think it's really fascinating that Cheras, Cholas, and Pandyas have been around since, at some level, since like the BCs. And they existed for thousands of years in some sense.
That's right. I think the one place where I might differ a little bit was with respect to the Cheras. I might be wrong here, but I think they were a major power, I think, till 10th or 11th century. But in the period that we are discussing, I think the Pandyas controlled much of the erstwhile Chera territory in the 13th century.
No, they absolutely did control that territory, but the Cheras still had kingdoms at that time, minor feudal kingdoms.
Yeah, maybe they were subordinate to the Pandyas.
Absolutely, they were. I mean, we hear about them until roughly the 15th, 16th century. So I do think that they were still around. I mean, they might not have been doing much, but they were still there.
Right.
Right. To sort of wrap up then the political map, what about the Yadavas? That's the other dynasty you spoke about, Shrikanth, at the beginning of the episode.
Right. The Yadavas were, again, I think, feudatories of the Western Chalukya kingdom. And they became independent towards the end of 12th century. So as I mentioned, the Western Chalukyas declined before the Cholas did, right? And the Yadavas and the Hoysalas had both become independent by the time we reached the end of the 12th century. And Yadavas were based further up north. Their capital was in Devagiri, which I think is modern Aurangabad, in that area, right? We don't know about the origins of the Yadavas, what language. I mean, the early Yadavas, I think, may have been Kannada speaking, but I think as the Yadava rule progressed, you see the growth of inscriptions in Marathi, right? And you see Marathi emerging out of the shadows. I know Maharashtrian Prakrit has always been there as a literary language of some prestige since the days of Shatavahanas, right? But for much of the period we discussed in the prior episodes, you had empires based in Karnataka extending their sway in Maharashtra, right? And many of these empires had primarily patronized Kannada and Sanskrit. But now under Yadavas, you see the emergence of Marathi literature, right? So someone like, say, Dhyaneshwar, who I think composed one of the early Marathi works, a commentary on Bhagavad Gita, I think in 13th century, he operated in Yadava territory, right?
He did.
Yeah.
The Dhyaneshwari. I mean, we'll talk about it, but it's an amazing text.
Yeah. So I think that the Yadava period is marked by the emergence of Marathi literature, and it's also a very rich period culturally. I think the Yadava court had some pretty great names. One of the great works on Indian classical music, Sangeeta Ratnakara, was composed by a Kashmiri person named Sharanga Deva in Yadava court, right? And even the great mathematician Bhaskaracharya, he was also, I think, his great work is Siddhanta Shiromani, which is one of the great mathematical works. It has some early ideas with respect to calculus. He also was a Maharashtrian, right? He operated in Yadava territory, right? So it's a very rich period in a cultural sense.
Yeah. And we discussed last time a bit of Sangeeta Ratnakara,
right.
Sarangadeva, right? So,
right.
I mean, we covered it under the Kashmir period, North India, just because the author Sarangadeva was a Kashmiri. But I think you're right. He was patronized in South India at the time to engage in the text.
So, who are some of the prominent Yadava kings? What are some of the names that one would sort of mention when we were talking Yadava kings?
Yeah, I think the person who, I think one of the early kings was a person named Bhillama, if I'm not wrong. Right? I need to just revise my notes a little bit. It's not coming to the top of my head. I think there was a king named Narasimha, if I'm not wrong. Narasimha was a Chalukya king. I'll get back to this if I recall some big names here, right? But
I'll put them as part of the episode notes.
Yeah, I think one of the late Yadava kings was Ramadeva, who is also known as Ramachandra in sources, right? We don't know what his actual name was. Either Ramadeva or Ramachandra. I think he was one of the late Yadava kings, and he was succeeded by Singhana. I think these were the final two kings of the Yadava empire, right? And it was during Ramadeva's rule that Malik Kafur raided the Deccan, right? He raided Daulatabad, what was Devagiri back then. And I think Ramadeva was caught unawares and he surrendered, basically, right? And I think his son Singhana was out at that time. He was, I think, busy in somewhere down in the deep south.
I think it was campaign against the Hoysalas or Kakatiyas, something.
Right.
One of those two.
That's right. Yeah. So, but Ramadeva's surrender was rather meek, and Ramadeva actually surrendered a lot of wealth to Malik Kafur, and he pledged his loyalty to Alauddin Khilji. I think he even gave one of his daughters to Alauddin Khilji, if I'm not wrong. I may be mistaken here, right? So that was a pretty tame surrender. And I think after that, because of this surrender, I think the Delhi Sultanate allowed the Yadavas to continue as a subordinate power, right? So I think it was practically a part of the Delhi Sultanate, but they were basically acknowledging the suzerainty of the Delhi Sultanate, right? But they continued as a nominal power. So he's the one Yadava king I know of, right? Right.
Yeah, but the most prominent Yadava king was Simhana II, right? Villama V was the founder, and
Simhana II. Yeah, sure.
Simhana II. Right.
So, just to add to what Shrikanth was saying, so that remains one of the most well-known pieces of history, at least in Maharashtra, how the Yadavas fell first to Alauddin Khilji in 1293 or around that time. That was when the famous Battle of Devgiri was lost, and it was like almost 300 kind of situation, 2,000 men or so capturing the big fort, which was not rationed properly for war, and with a small force, and that too using some bluff which Alauddin Khilji and his commanders played. That was around 1293. Then the Yadavas rebelled again around 1305, 1306. And then 1308 was the final put down of Yadavas, when they stopped being like a power of reckon. And that remains a very important event, for that was the time when Sultanate actually got a foothold down south. And if you see even the Sultanate history, the Yadava horde was very critical for Alauddin Khilji,
right,
gaining the power of Delhi from his uncle Jalaluddin. So he used the wealth he got from the raid of Devgiri and other places in Deccan to usurp power and kill his uncle. So he remains the one who brought the Sultanate down south, Alauddin Khilji, and especially Malik Kafur. So one of the very famous novels, one of the very famous novels on Raja Shivaji, written by a writer called Babasaheb Purandare, it starts with that event, the capture of Devgiri. So actually, so it remained Devgiri till then. It became what we call Daulatabad under Muhammad bin Tughlaq. But we'll come to that. Right. But that's a very sort of a watershed moment for history down south.
Correct. Right. So moving on to the non-political aspects of the history, who are some of the leading philosophers of this age, Shrikanth? Where are they based?
Before we move there, I think we need to close this period with a discussion of Delhi Sultanate, right?
Yeah, no, I thought we'll sort of take it in the second half of the episode, but sure, we can do that. So what are the early...
here? Yeah, so go ahead.
Yeah. No, so what are the early... what is the earliest record of the Delhi Sultanate reaching down south? The early Islamic influence, was it always through war, or was there also an effort through missionaries to bring Islam down south?
I don't think there's missionaries.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. No, go ahead, Shrikanth. But I don't recall reading ever missionaries. I do think it came... I mean, obviously there's that one situation where we do know that there was a mosque that was built roughly around the 7th or 8th century, right after, Mohammed, and then they came down to... The traders came down to the Malabar region and built the mosque. But I think otherwise than that, it's any interaction with Islam has been always through some sort of violent interaction, to my record. Right. I mean, I could be wrong, but this is my understanding.
Yeah, I mean, Islam always had a marginal presence in Kerala through trade. That's a different matter. But when we talk about this period, I think the interaction with Islam was mostly in the battlefield. That's how it was always a confrontational interaction, right? And I think the major interactions begin in the Khilji period. Alauddin Khilji sent Malik Kafur, one of his generals down south, in the early 1300s. Right, so Malik Kafur first raided Devagiri, and Ramadeva, basically, or Ramachandra as he's called in some places. He surrenders much of the treasure to Malik Kafur, and then Malik Kafur ventures further down south. He raids the Halebit, or Dwarasamudra, and Hoysala was considerably weakened by that. And then he keeps going further down south, right? And Sundara Pandya actually invites Malik Kafur to raid Madurai, because Sundara Pandya wanted his crown back, right? So he reaches all the way down to Srirangam, Madurai, right? Or to the Tamil country. But then Malik Kafur, during that period, I don't think all of these areas came under Khilji rule as such, right? Because Malik Kafur's primary interest was raiding and loot, right, from the temples.
Well, it is interesting to note that Alauddin did marry what the Yadava's king's daughter.
Right.
I forget the name. And then his dynasty continued with the daughter, with the child of the daughter with the Hindu king, right?
That's right.
So it's actually very interesting. He had multiple wives, but the dynasty continued with the child of the Kafir's daughter.
Didn't actually continue, because most historians feel that Malik Kafur was the one holding the reins, and the Khilji Empire actually went out. But yeah, he was the successor, the son from the Devagiri princess. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean I guess the statutory successor. We don't know who. I mean, maybe the other guy
I don't think the sultanates had a statutory successor or so. It was
no.
Just,
I don't mean statutory as in like law. I just mean like he appointed some dude, his son, as a successor, but there was someone else behind that was actually pulling the reins.
Right. Yeah. So as we were saying, Malik Kafur was primarily interested in plunder, right? And at that point, all of these regions we spoke about, they were not actually a Khilji territories as such, despite the plunder, right? So Malik Kafur returned to Delhi, of course, right? And it was about a decade later that Ulugh Khan, who was, I think, the son of the Tughlaq dynasty founder, right, Ghiazuddin, who came down south again, right? And Ulugh Khan's invasions were of a different character. So Ulugh Khan raided the temple towns of Srirangam, right? And we know Ulugh Khan today by the name Muhammad bin Tughlaq. So Ulugh Khan eventually became Muhammad bin Tughlaq, right? And his invasions were of a different nature. He actually annexed much of this territory, right? So much of the Yadava territory, the Kakatiya territory, came under Tughlaq rule. And he left governors even in the Malabar regions. Even in Madurai, you had Tughlaq governors who were stationed, right? But I don't think these Muhammad bin Tughlaq was a particularly good administrator, so he couldn't hold things together. And eventually there reached a point where a lot of these governors started revolting and they became independent. Most notably, the Bahmanis in northern Deccan, and the Madurai Sultanate in the deep south, right? And then there was also Hindu resistance in that period in the form of Vijayanagara and also the Reddy kings of Telangana and coastal Andhra, right? Who managed to wrest back control of much of the territory that Muhammad bin Tughlaq had won, right? And then as we discussed,
time also remains the funny time when the capital of India, so quote unquote India, was down south. So Muhammad bin Tughlaq had shifted the capital from Delhi to Daulatabad, near Aurangabad, which was Devagiri. So that remains a giant blunder in geopolitics, and that's why any bad dictatorial decisions are called Tughlaqi decisions in popular parlance today.
So Muhammad bin Tughlaq is a figure.
One point, I think just one interesting tidbit that I've read, and people can disagree, is so I read a couple authors like Ruth Vinita and a couple other people. It seems to me they've indicated that Alauddin Khilji and Malik Kafur were in a very interesting relationship throughout the course of their interactions together, right? Because technically, I think Malik Kafur was a eunuch, right? If I'm correct on this.
And he was a Hindu
And
convert, first generation.
yeah, he was a Hindu convert, but he was also eunuch, right? From my understanding.
Right.
And they had some weird. I mean, not weird. They had some sources indicate, or scholars tend to think that they had a sexual relationship between the two of them, and that is what led to, like, even though, when my point before, his Alauddin Khilji's son becoming the de facto ruler of the heir to the empire, Malik Kafur was actually the one who pulled the reins, because Malik Kafur was the one that was, I guess, a partner of Khilji. So it's just something that I think a lot of scholars have discussed in terms of their understanding of their relationship. Now, I'm not saying it's true or not, but it's just something to throw out there. It just throws a little interesting tidbit into what most people would consider to be Alauddin Khilji to be like this Islamic fanatical like conqueror, and then you have something that's so what you would consider anti-Islamic in the sense of having relationships with men. It's just, I think it's interesting, like a dichotomy there.
Right.
Sure. No, we'll talk about Muhammad bin Tughlaq and Alauddin Khilji in following episodes when we talk of Delhi Sultanate. Shrikanth, I wanted to pick your minds on what is it that these invaders from north were bringing to the battlefield in terms of technology, in terms of strategy, that these kingdoms which had been around for centuries just crumbled. Do we know anything about that?
To be honest, I'm not that well read on the military technology of this period. Maybe we can do more research on it and add to the episode notes if needed, right? But
Sure.
I wouldn't want to talk about it. But it's interesting that we mention it, because I think it's Marco Polo, who of course preceded the invasions from the Delhi Sultanate, right? He traveled through South India in the 1290s. He remarked in his travelogues that the southern kingdoms, they cultivate, they are domesticating a lot of horses, and he viewed this rather pejoratively. He felt the horses are of inferior quality. They're not being nurtured well. The South Indian weather doesn't suit them. So it's an interesting observation that maybe the southern armies were not really equipped with the right cavalry of a high quality, right? And maybe that's probably
I think you're right there, Shrikanth. I think you're absolutely right.
Cavalry was obviously one of the core reasons, but decadence is also, we can also blame decadence, especially in case of the Devgiris. So they had a huge army, and it was just bad tactics for Ramachandra to lose, because the force of Alauddin Khilji was very small, and they bluffed, and they started a rumor that another force of, when the siege started, they started a rumor that a force of 10,000 is coming from up north, while it was not coming. On the other hand, the force of the son of Ramachandra was coming in 5-6 days, but still the monarch surrendered. So that particular bit was just military genius, or what you can say, of the Khiljis, Malik Kafur person. So
and there was also
but I also think it fares to be discussed. Like, the victories that happened were not always decisive, and they weren't happening at once, right? These were constant skirmishes that ended up having, people pulling from territory, right? Making inroads, being pushed back, pushed back. It wasn't as if like there was a total routing every single time. Like the technology was so strong that it just destroyed everything across the board. It was probably maybe better tactics, I mean, it just wasn't a technology issue, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Right. And towards the latter part of the 14th century, we do see a reversal, right? In the sense of Hindu kingdoms wresting back control from Tughlaqs, right? And that's notably the case in Andhra, where the Reddy kings managed to wrest back control of much of Telangana from the Tughlaqs, right? And towards the end of the 14th century, you had the great Vijayanagara prince Kumara Kampanna, who actually managed to defeat the Mughal, the Madurai Sultanate in the deep south, right? I think that was in the 1370s or so, right? And he actually managed to liberate both Srirangam and Madurai. And I think Mukunda is probably aware of it. For about a 40-year period from 1330s to 1370s, the main murti in Srirangam was actually taken away, and it was in Tirupati. And Kumara Kampanna was the one who defeated the Madurai Sultanate. He liberated the temple town of Srirangam and brought back the murti to where it belongs, right? And he's still hailed in the annals of the Srirangam temple as the liberator of the town, right? So these are examples where the indigenous kings did manage to defeat and reverse many of the gains made by the Delhi Sultanate or the successors of the Delhi Sultanate, like the Madurai Sultans, right?
A part of me also thinks like some of this is actually due to internal strife between the kingdoms, right? Like usually these kings had animosities with other kings, and they used the power of the Delhi Sultanate or other invaders to do what they wanted to do, and then in the process lost. They would have to give something to get something, and they want to see their antagonists lose, so they want to do whatever they can to get them to lose, and even if it meant to bend a knee or whatever. Not. So it might not all be technology. Some of this is real politics.
Correct. Yeah. And I know it's a bit of a cliche to say united we stand, divided we fall, but that's actually true in this case, right? And there's also chance involved. Like, for instance, when Malik Kafur, I think, raided Devagiri, the Ramadeva's son, or Ramachandra's son, Singhana, was it his name? He was actually busy down south. So he wasn't present at the right place at the right time, right? And Singhana was the one who was more...
That first raid was done by Alauddin himself. The second raid, which brought about total destruction, was by Malik Kafur.
Malik Kafur, right, correct. And there's also the example of Sundara Pandya down in the deep south, who actually invited Malik Kafur to raid Madurai, right? So these are examples where the local kings actually lacked a spine and for selfish or short-sighted reasons collaborated with the Sultanate.
Yeah, and also you can see, like, if you can imagine a wrecking ball of sorts. So the north was united under the Sultanate, sort of united, and it was united for small time. There were rebellions going on, but every now and then it was united and strong. And then once the Yadav dynasty fell, so they could use Yadav dynasty soldiers and Yadav support to attack the Hoysalas and the Kakatiyas. So that sort of, they kept on gaining and becoming larger as well. So yet the Kakatiyas put up a strong front and they wrestled the control back a couple of times. And again, there was the pushback by Reddys. So unlike with the Mughals, with the guns, there was no decisive technological advantage as such here.
Right.
So it was mainly cavalry, which also Vijayanagar Empire then started importing a lot of horses. That is how that is given as one of the reasons for their rise as well. They imported a lot of horses, which eventually is said to have led to their downfall because they lost so much of money that they had to expand their taxes and so on and so on. But that's for a later episode, maybe, for Vijayanagar Empire.
Yeah. So we'll do a dedicated episode on Vijayanagar Empire.
Right.
So moving on, this is broadly what the political map and the political scene looks like. But while so what is it that people in these kingdoms are doing, and especially who are the leading philosophers, and what is the religious dynamic? What are the various religious orders that are in play across these kingdoms?
Yeah. So I think when Mukunda, you want to go, or you want me to cover?
Yeah, I'll start. It's fine.
Okay.
So I think this is part of this is I want to try to connect it to what we talked about last episode, right? When we talked about
Right.
the growth of North Indian intellectual thought and Kashmir and so on. So there's a thread that connects here, right? Is roughly around this time and maybe a little before, there was a movement of a lot of North Indian, and this might be controversial, but whatever, it's the reality. A lot of North Indian Brahmins down to the south. That was actually requested by many of the kingdoms, Uchera, Cholas, Pandyas, starting from the 6th to 10th century, requesting these brahmanas, they give them land grants, so on and so forth, for them to come down to these regions to institute Vedic, philosophical, whatever you want to do. And I think as a byproduct of that, what you start seeing is the growth of I'm not saying there wasn't intellectual development. There was. It was very lot of Buddhist, Jain, some Vedic development in the south before the Gupta period and a little after. But what you see is suddenly an explosion occur roughly around the 9th century and then onwards. And so in the 9th century, and then the person I want to say for at least Sri Vaishnavism is 10th century is Yamunacharya, right? So I want to connect this to the larger growth that occurs across the board in South India. Is Yamunacharya, who is South Indian, a Brahmin, and he's part of this tradition that is the Alvar tradition that goes back to, within the traditional view goes back to, 2,000, 3,000 years ago. But the current historic view is probably like 4th, 5th, 6th century, maybe a little after that, of Tamil Prabandhams. So Yamunacharya writes his text called Agama
Pramanya.
Yeah, Agama Pramanya, which is a defense of, interesting enough, connects to the last episode, is defense of Kashmiri texts, Kashmiri Tantric Agama texts, which is mostly Pancharatra. So his defense, he writes his text on the defense of Pancharatra, which is considered at that time Kashmiri. And he writes this text on this. And it's, it starts this intellectual development that takes into this successor, which is Ramanuja, right? Ramanuja is I think, in my position, and Shrikanth, you may or may not agree, or even Gaurav, is the intellectual powerhouse, the spiritual powerhouse that happens on the 11th century in South India that affects all of India after that. So Ramanujacharya roughly his dates are considered, I think, like 1020 to 1120 is I think the rough dates they give. He lived 400 years, maybe he lived for 80 years, but he did live a very long time. And interesting enough, unlike Shankara, who wrote most of his works in his younger period, as the hagiographies go, Ramanuja wrote most of his works in his later period, because Ramanujacharya had a grihastha lifestyle. He was born, married, had been taught, and one of the reasons he left the grihastha ashrama was because his teacher at that time, I believe it was Peyanambi, was a non-Brahmin, and his wife, Ramanuja's wife, felt very uncomfortable about having to interact and share with the wife of a non-Brahmin, and she had insulted him and his wife. So Ramanuja left her at that point to take on sannyasa, because for him this didn't make sense. I mean, Srikanth, am I wrong here? Am I right?
I think you're right. I'm not sure if he was a formal teacher. I think he was an associate, right? I think Pariyanambi or Mahapurna, I think his name was Mahapurna.
There's Tirukachinambi and there's Pariyanambi, and Pariyanambi was, I think, he was the one that was teaching him at the time.
Correct. Right, and he was probably of a merchant caste, or maybe a lower Brahmin subcaste, or maybe an earlier settler. I don't know, one of those two.
We don't know exactly what that community was, right? Yeah. So then he becomes a sannyasi, and he writes. I mean, compared to most people, he wrote a limited number of texts. There's 3 major texts, philosophical texts he wrote: Sri Bhashya. Then he had the Gita Bhashya, and then he had the Vedanta Sangraha. And then he had his 3 non philosophical texts, Rangagadyam, Vaikunthagadyam, and the third one. Oh, I forgot. Oh, shoot. Do you know the third one? Okay, it's fine. Whatever it is. But he wrote the roughly just maybe six texts is assigned to him. But the work he did changed the course of all the temples in South India and across India for the most part. And then many people will say this is the origin of the Bhakti movement that had changed the course of South India, North India, any part of India, because his fundamental viewpoint was all beings, whether human, varna, jati, whatever it is, if they are part of what's known as the Bhagavatas or Vaishnavites, cannot have any sort of demarcation between them spiritually. So that movement took off in a fantastic way. Now, he had philosophical differences with someone like Shankara, and we can get into that if we want to. It was about the nature of Brahman as being impersonal, nirguna, anirvachaniya, that kind of stuff, versus Ramanuja's, which is very much sabesha, which means possessing of all qualities, all Ramanuja used sarva kalyana guna, which is all perfect, amazing, beautiful qualities and negation of all negative ones. So he had a very personal deity who was a Ramanuja was kind of a panentheist. He wasn't a pantheist like Spinoza, but he was a panentheist, meaning like Brahman, his vision of God was not only the universe, but was more than the universe. It was infinitely more. And that movement started kind of having vast repercussions all across India. And then you had like the movement of during this period where a supposed, I actually think so, a disciple of Ramanuja or his lineage called Ramananda, who moved to the north, became the teacher of Eknath, Tukaram, that later affected, what we get to Gyaneshwar, we'll talk about later, or Mirabai, or Surdas, all these Bhakti movement in the north. And then you have in the south, you have the interaction of Ramanuja's philosophy with development later with Madhwas or other traditions. So Ramanuja's philosophy in terms of the philosophical and social side, I think is probably one of the most impactful ideas, theories, and practices that we can talk about, because we're just talking about philosophically. I'm not even talking about like traditionally, like for the temples. Like the temples in all South India have drastically shifted from Ramanuja's time, because Ramanuja instituted certain practices that were aligned with Pancharatra texts. Like, for example, Srirangam it's very unique in this way. Srirangam, like most temples, didn't allow, I'm not going to say most temples. Some temples didn't allow non-Brahmins to come into Garbhagriha, which is the region where the god is, whereas, worshipped and garlanded and clothed and so on. Ramanuja's tradition had developed the role for every community to interact with the deity within the administration of the temple. So, for example, Srirangam, there's this entire group of this community called the Satadas, which is which is non-Brahmin Shudra communities that have power over the temple, can actually have certain rights over the deity that not even the Brahmins have. And this was instituted by Ramanuja from 1,000 years ago. And many of the temples across of South India and even some North India, I will say this, I think it's very fascinating. When I went to Gujarat one time, 20 years ago, I went to Dwarka, and I saw this stamba in the middle of Dwarka, and I read the inscription, and it was retranslated. It was like Ramanujacharya had come here, put the stamba here. He had made this a pita, a region, or whatever. So it's very interesting the depth and breadth of what occurred with Ramanuja. So I just want to stop there with him. So if you guys want to talk about it, go ahead.
Shrikanth, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think Mukunda summed up Ramanuja and his contributions very well, and I agree with him that he was a very pivotal figure. in the growth of theism, especially among the masses, right? And if you think about this period, if you look at the 9th, 10th century, if you look at empires like Rashtrakutas, or for that matter, even Western Chalukyas, right? Many of them were still Jain in the early part of this period, right? The Hoysalas started out as Jain, right? And even one of the Chola kings, Kulotunga II, he was actually fascinated by the Jain epic Jivaka Chintamani in his youth, right? But what you see in this period from 1100 onwards is the growth of theism, Hindu theism, and the growth of sectarianism, both Vaishnava sectarianism as well as the Shaiva sectarianism, right? And I think this had a major role in basically marking the end of Jaina influence down south. It became very marginal, and it is still a marginal influence to this day, but it ceased to be dominant as it once was, right? So if you look at this period from say 1100 to about 1300, you could say that this is the period which marks the growth of the devotional cults, both on the Vaishnava side and as well as on the Shaiva side. Then you also had the rise of Veerashaivism in the northern part of the Deccan, right? In southern Maharashtra and Karnataka.
And also Lingayas. Yeah.
Right. Correct. And I think these movements played a major role in, I think it helped that these movements emerged when they did, because I think it made the empires and the kings who adopted these theistic religions less pacifist, right? And it kind of equipped them with the theological fervor to take on the Islamic forces. I think there is that angle to it as well, right?
I'm going to push back on that because I don't think so. Part of the problem with general Vaishnavism in this time period is they're also very much like Jainas, right? They're very pacifist. They're not any different from their ethical standpoints, right? You know, we know they tend not to eat, like, historically, maybe we adopted it over time. We don't eat onions, we don't eat garlic. There's just these things that we have adopted about them. Even violence itself was considered wrong.
I think, yeah.
So I just want to say one thing. I think you're right somewhat when it comes to the realm of the kings and the administration, because I don't think mass wise most people were Jainas. I don't think that was the case. I think it was this dynamic of the lay people.
Yeah, I was referring to the elites. That's right.
Yeah, the elites, right? So what you end up having is this shift from Buddhist Jains to Vaishnavism and Shaivism. But I don't know if that necessarily meant that it became more violent or more open to violence in that period. Because
I think I probably had Shaivism in mind when I made that comment, right? Especially when you look at the emergence of the Reddy kings in the 14th century, right? The Pralaya Vema Reddy and others who managed to get back the control of much of the territory won by the Tughlaqs. Right? They were strongly Shaiva, right? And even the Kakatiya kings were strongly Shaiva, right? And that probably did contribute to the animus towards the alien religion from the north, right? And had the ruling classes been, say, predominantly Jaina at that point, it might have been more problematic for them to resist Muslim rule.
The Jainas, so I'll push back into first. So Jainas even had their own interesting theory about this, right? When you had their Vasudeva, Prativasudeva, the entire tradition of violence being somewhat necessary for the institution of kingship, right? So it wasn't as if like the Jaina kings were, oh no, we're going to go to the forest and kill ourselves, or we're going to stand before the enemy and let them stab us. I don't think that was it at all. And the Jaina kings understood that their ethical duty was to take on the burden of himsa so that their people didn't have to, right? Correct. So this is what I think is like, I think a lot of these ideas and theories about the nature of Jainism, Buddhism, and Hinduism in this sense are very Western insofar as saying this is what Jainas believe. This is what Vaishnavas believe. And that's not true because we have our own political theories. We have our own historical philosophical ideas, but with the necessity of violence in our world.
Yeah, so just interjecting there. Adding to what Mukunda said. So in the Jain Ramayana, Lakshman kills Ravan and Ram doesn't. So that is also sort of goes. So Lakshman has to kill Ravan to maintain the order, while Ram, being the true Jain, doesn't kill. So that about the division of duties sort of is also comes into there.
Yeah, I think I was not trying to make the point that the Jain kings were completely pacifist. I mean, no king can be pacifist, right? That was not the point. I think the point was that the theological fervor did contribute, to some extent at least, to the anti-Muslim animus among the elites, right?
But what evidence do we have of that?
I think it's there in some of the literature as well, the Veerashaiva literature, right? So, for instance, if you look at the author of Basava Purana, right? I forget his name, Somanatha, right? He talks about the fact that true Shaivas should not even trade with a non-Shaiva. They should not even talk to a non-Shaiva. They should just shun non-Shaivas. And Veerashaivism was a very strong Shaivite movement in the northern part of the Deccan. And many of these Andhra chieftains and kings we discussed, they were partial to that movement, right?
But that doesn't show. Yeah, but that doesn't show your antagonist to Muslims. Your antagonist to anyone.
No, I think Mukunda, the point Shrikanth's making is not that it was a source of antagonism towards Muslims. It was perhaps the glue that got everybody together. I think that's the point that Shrikanth's making.
But that applied to Jains too. That applied to Hindus too. Like whether you're Vaishnavite, Shaivite, or whatever, like you would more likely than not interact with, like for example, Sri Vaishnavites, right? Like our community, for the most part, will not worship Shiva, will not worship anything outside of the Vishnu world.
But I think there's you can sense the aggression a lot more in the Shaivite text, especially in the Veerashaiva text, right? In Basava Purana, non-Shaivas are referred to as bhavis, right? And you should just not tolerate them, right? They're intolerable, right? And just expressed explicitly in those terms. And it might have, I don't want to...
okay, we are in the realms of speculation. So we are in the realms of speculation. So sort of moving on. So Shrikanth, so we spoke about Ramanujam. Who's the other prominent philosopher from this era whose legacy sort of still survives and the idea still
I think the most prominent, in fact, Ramanuja is slightly preceding this period, right? Though he spent some part of his life after 1100. I think the one important philosophical thinker from this period is, of course, Madhva in coastal Karnataka, who had a realist philosophy, right? And also a dualist philosophy, right? He emphasized dual. It's probably the only Vedanta philosophy which is strongly dualist, unlike the monism of Shankara or the qualified monism of
everybody else. Everybody else.
Right. And Madhva's philosophy is very distinct, right? It's very different from any other Vedantic philosophy to a great extent, right? And Madhva's ideas did contribute to a significant extent to the Bhakti movement down south in the centuries to come, right? Maybe we don't necessarily need to get into the details of Dvaita movement, right? But one interesting thing I would like to mention about this period from the religious angle is the emergence of the Matha as a central Hindu institution, a Brahminical institution, right? I know if you ask traditionalists, they will say all of the Shankara Mathas go back thousands of years, right? But to be honest, the Mathas, both on the Smarta side as well as on the Vaishnava side, be it Sri Vaishnava or Dvaita, right? A lot of the Mathas have their origins in this period, 13th century, 14th century, right? Even the Sringeri Matha, which is supposed to have been set up by Adi Shankara, right? The history of the Sringeri Matha is very patchy between, say, 8th century and 13th century. So the first major figure that you get in Sringeri Matha in historical sources is Vidyaranya, right? Who was the kingmaker and the guru for Harihara and Bukka, the founders of the Vijayanagara Empire, right? So this marks a period when the Matha emerges as a central Brahminical institution, right? And many Mathas, be it the Mathas in Udupi or the Sri Vaishnava mathas like Parakala Mata, Ahobila Mata, right? Or for that matter, Sringeri, right? They were probably established in this period. Though this will ruffle a few feathers. I think traditionalists will argue Sringeri Mata goes back to the time of Shankara himself, right? Which is fair. Having said that, we really don't hear much about the Sringeri Mata till Vidyaranya, right? So I think that's a very, very important change in the way Hindu elites organize themselves, Hindu thought organized itself.
No, absolutely. And I think we touched on this last time. I think it's utterly taken from the Buddhist Sangha view, the system, the administration, and shifted over to the Hindu version, which is it probably did start with Shankara with the four matas, the Govardhana and Sringeri, the Kashmir, and then I forget the one, the Puri or whatever. And then you have Kanchi, which is not considered by most others to be part of matas. But then you have the growth of the matas from Ramanuja's time, Madhava's time, and then you have Nimrakar, everyone else. So I just want to say for Madhvacharya, I think like his Dvaita philosophy, which is amazing and it's really interesting, and I disagree with many of it, but I think it's fascinatingly well reasoned. I will put this perspective, like his movement when Madhvacharya started his movement, and he started off, his name was Ananda Tirtha when he became his Tirtha, when he became an Acharya. But his entire movement was called the Dasa movement, right? So you have, from him comes from, Vyasaraya Tirtha, Purandara Dasa, you have, who else you have? The Kanakadasa, Vardhatita Raghavendra, who is big. So this tradition has impacted, again, South India in an amazing, beautiful way, right? Carnatic music today, the music that we all sing in South India, is utterly developed within this tradition of Madhva, from Purandara Rasa onwards, right? So the Carnatic system is developed by someone that was accepted this tradition. And you have songs like Chandrachuda Shiva Shankara, Parvati Ramanagavi, Namo Namo. There's many songs that people know. If you mention them, they will, like, for example, in North India, you had Bhimsen Joshi sing numerous songs of the Dasas, right? He had, Bhagya the Lakshmi Bharama. People might have known these songs, but they've existed for now 500-600 years. This movement was not only a philosophical movement, also but a social movement, where Purandasa and all the people around him traveled across the country singing songs, connecting to regular people, talking about the nature of God, the nature of the soul, nature of interaction with each other. Like they would talk about, Muddy Ninnu, Muddy Ninnu. This is a song my Kannada is terrible, by the way. So I learned Kannada only because my father taught me, because he's a Kannada guy. But these songs are written in Kannada, which is a very South Indian language. And Kannada at this time also developed another text, which is called Kumaravyasa, had written roughly around the 11th century, this Mahabharata. So he was called Kumaravyasa, which means little or young Vyasa. And he wrote this amazing text called, his Mahabharata, Kumarvyasa's Mahabharata. And in that text, to this day, that text is performed in what's known as Harikathas. Harikathas developed this time period within the Madhva tradition, and what they do is they travel across the country, and they sing these songs, they sing these stories, they develop these entire narratives around these stories. My uncle, who passed away, like 5 years ago, in his late 80s, he lived in the U.S., but he started doing Harikathas in his like 70s, right? Where he would travel across the U.S. and India, and each Harikatha was a insulated small story. It might be the story of Bhishma, taken from Kumaravyasa. So you half the thing you sing the lyrics of the text that Kumaravyasa wrote, and then you give a commentary as you sing. And it was a beautiful way to engage an audience. And this tradition developed within the Madhva tradition and continued on for now 500 years, and people still do it, right? For example, S.P. Balasubramanian, who people know across all of India, right? His father was a Harikatha person who grew up doing Harikathas. So I do think these things we don't, that we think are taken for granted, they actually have these ancient antecedent precedent for it. So that's just I would love to talk about the philosophy, but I don't know if it will be too much at this point.
While we are on religion and philosophy, so Mukunda, if you could spare a little bit of time, I want to cover a couple of things which we haven't discussed so far. Mukunda spoke about the growth of Bhakti movement, right? And in this context, we already discussed Madhva a great deal. There was also a doctrinal schism emerging within Sri Vaishnavism, which happened to a significant extent during this period. So one major figure we have to discuss when we discuss this period from 1100 to 1400 is the great Vedanta Deshika, right? Venkatanatha, right? It was probably one of the most brilliant people. Right. Yeah, and I think it was a very multifaceted figure who was born in the vicinity of Kanchipuram, I think sometime in late 13th century. He probably lived close to 100 years. So a very versatile figure, right, who was a poet, a writer of epics, right, a philosopher, a theologian, right, a polemicist, right, so a divide developed within Sri Vaishnavism, which is indicative of the broader trend that Mukunda spoke about between the northern Sri Vaishnavites and the southern Sri Vaishnavites, right? And by north and south, it's not necessarily a geographic thing here. It refers to a doctrinal difference, right? I think the followers of Vedanta Deshika were more conservative in the sense that they stuck to the old Brahminical mores, emphasizing the need for ritual and the effort on the part of the devotee to attain liberation, right? On the other hand, you had the relatively more liberal and populist southern Sri Vaishnava movement, which got its expression towards the latter part of this period with Pulle Lokacharya and then his followers like Manavala Mamunigal, who lived towards the end of the 14th century, right? Who are relatively more populist, and they felt that liberation is purely contingent on God's grace, and it is not really contingent on conscious effort on the part of the devotee, right? In terms of ritual or in terms of doing specific things, right? And this is indicative of a broader trend towards populism in religion, right? Yeah.
So just to point on this, right? Like the designation of conservatism, I think socially, I think you're probably right, but I think when it comes to philosophically, right? For example, Vedanta treats Lakshmi as Vishnu and Lakshmi together. The Divya Dampatis together are Brahman, right? As opposed to the other tradition, which is Lokacharya, which is Lakshmi is the first amongst all the jivas, right? So very different. The nature of the masculine and feminine in Vedanta is they're connected. They're not separatable, and they're the same. As opposed to the tradition within the Tengale tradition, we call Vedanta tradition called Vadagale, which means the northern tradition. The Lokacharya Manava Mavanigal tradition in the south is called Tengale, which means southern tradition. And there's some differences, and the differences might be, for most people, minor. Might be like, for example, the northern school, Vedanta school, is called the school of the monkey, and the southern school is called school of the cat, because the idea of liberation is, in the northern school, just like a baby monkey clings to the mother monkey in order to be saved from wherever it is, so is the nature of God and the individual soul. Well, the southern school is a cat school, because just like a mother cat grabs the baby cat, and the baby cat does nothing, or the kitten does nothing, and the mother cat saves the kitten, that is the relationship between God and the soul. So these are doctrinal differences, and they apply across some levels, because in the southern school, caste is much less important than the northern school. Like Varna Jati is much less important in Bengali school than the Varnagata school. So these differences matter. But I do think like they're conservative in some areas, liberal in other areas, conservative in other areas. It's a very interesting dynamic. But it's also interesting to say that someone like Ramananda, who came from this school, went to the north, supposedly talked about the idea of annihilation of caste before Ambedkar. The nature of caste doesn't matter at all with the relationship with Bhagavan or Brahman.
Right. Shrikanth, you were saying, you were telling us about the split. You were also telling us about the split between the northern and the southern school. Can you talk to us more about this trend and the school of philosophy?
Which school of philosophy are you referring to?
The one we were just discussing about.
Yeah, I think Mukunda summed it up well, and we covered it at some length, right? It's basically the northern school adheres to what's called the school of the monkey, or Markata Kishora Nyaya versus Marjala Kishora Nyaya.
Right. So other than this, were there any significant? Was there any other significant divergence of thought from the way the Bhakti movement was evolving?
Yeah. Absolutely. So one of the major differences is the northern school, which is the school of Vedanteshika, placed emphasis more on the Vedas than it did on the Divya Prabandhams, right? So the Vedanteshika, who Shrikanth mentioned, is, I would say, on par with someone like Abhinavagupta, right? In Indian thought, when it comes to certain people that are like geniuses to the level of like stratosphere, Vedanteshika connects to that level, along with someone like Abhinavagupta, who we talked about last episode, right? Abhinavagupta wrote a commentary on the Natya Shastra. He developed the Trika philosophy. It was a polymath, a polyglot, whatever. Vedanteshika is very, very much similar. So Vedanteshika, in the sense, what he wrote not only philosophical texts like this text called Shatadushini, which was 101 objections to all of Advaita's points. He also wrote texts like I think it was called Raghava Vijayam. Is that correct, Shrikanth? That it was
Yadavabhyudayam.
Yeah, Yadavabhyudayam, which is if you read it from front to end, it's the story of Krishna. If you read it from backwards to forwards, it's the story of Rama. I believe that's correct. I could be wrong.
Yeah. I heard
Maybe
that.
So,
And then
he also wrote another work, a poem named Paduka Sahasram, which is actually more popular, right?
Yeah.
It's an interesting one. I think he wrote it. The legend goes that he wrote it over a couple of nights or something like that to win a debate, right? He was a very multifaceted figure. Yeah.
There was this philosopher by the name of Appaya Dikshit, who was a very
much
strong,
later figure. Yes, yeah,
much later figure, who was a very strong Advaitin and a Shaivite, who in his own works would call Vedanteshika the greatest thinker that ever existed, right? So the person that was exactly the polemical opposite of Vedanteshika talked about it. So Vedanteshika was actually like, even today, people are dealing with his philosophical conversations and his positions on his various ideas about time. Like, I know a philosopher right now who's writing about Vedanteshika's concept of time because it's so fascinating. So Vedanteshika is very interesting. Go ahead.
Yeah, I know a lot of us are on Twitter. There is this Indologist by name Eliza Freshy on Twitter.
She does
a lot of good work on Vedanta Deshika, if I'm not wrong. And she has a very good essay on Vedanta Deshika, which is posted on the internet. The Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, right? I think that's probably one of the best essays on the internet on Vedanta Deshika. Yeah.
Right. So I don't want to go ahead. I don't want to make this all about Sri Vaishnavism, but I wanted to jump into Lingayats and so on.
No. So we'll sort of move on, and we'll post all these links as part of the episode notes. And perhaps someday we'll have a dedicated episode only on the philosophers of this age. Shrikanth,
just one final tidbit that I probably need to mention.
Sure.
We discussed Bhakti movement a lot, but we also discussed Vidyaranya earlier in the call, right? And Vidyaranya was actually the brother of a major Vedic scholar of the name of Sayanacharya, right? So while we discussed bhakti a great deal, the old Vedic religion was still very much prevalent and retained a considerable respect, right? And Sayanacharya wrote, the Vijayanagara kings actually commissioned Sayana and his entourage of scholars to write commentaries on the Vedas,
Rigveda.
right? Especially the Rigveda Samhita, right? And these commentaries are one of their kind, right? Nothing of that kind existed at the same scale before Sayanacharya.
There was Nilakanta. Nilakanta had something like that. But
right.
yes,
Sayana. There was also Venkata Madhava in the Tamil country in the Chola period, but Sayanacharya did it at a different scale on all the Vedic Samhitas, right? And I forget the name of his text, Vedartha Deepika or something like that. And this is very influential because even in 19th century, when Indologists like Max Muller were trying to interpret Rigveda, they relied on Sayanacharya's commentaries, right? And even today, a lot of the Indologists, when they try to study Vedic literature, their go-to place is Sayana's commentaries. That's how they first they attempt to understand it from the traditional standpoint before giving their own independent commentary, right? So it's very influential even on Indology, Sayana's commentaries.
Yeah, right. Fascinating stuff. Now, moving on to some of the other names that crop up in this era. First of all, we mentioned a gentleman called Dhyaneshwara. Who's this? Who's this person? What's his contribution?
So, yeah, Dhyaneshwara is freaking brilliant, right? He wrote this text called Dhyaneshwari, which I read a long time ago. And it's so Dhyaneshwar is somewhat connected to the Nath Sampradaya and also the Advaita Sampradaya. It's a very interesting mix. So his father, I think his father's name was Vittalba or something. No, I think it's something like that. His father is interesting. It's very fascinating. He was a householder who left being a householder, became a sannyasi when his kids were already there. And when his guru found out he was a householder who left, sent him back. And he went back to his family. And because he went back to the family and left the sannyasi path to go back to being grihastha, which was not considered okay within certain Brahminical circles, his entire family was considered untouchables. So they were basically ostracized from their community. His parents, from the legends, committed suicide. He had two brothers and one sister. Nivritti Sopan was her two brothers, and his sister, oh my God, I forget her name. Oh my God, it's so terrible. Let me see if I can find her name, because it was very important, because she wrote a couple texts too. Let me see here. Hold on. I have Muktabai, yes.
Nivrittinath was the brother.
Yeah, Nivrittinath, and then Sopan. So these four children,
very famous.
Yeah. These four children they went out and they developed their own panth in some sense, or their own path. And one of those things that came from this path was Dhyaneshwar wrote this text called Dhyaneshwari, which is basically the light on the Gita, written from his perspective, and it's probably the first commentary on the Gita written in non-Sanskrit. It's written in Marathi in a different meter called Ovid. Right? It's a very different meter than normal Vedic, because Vedic meters would be chandas. It'll be like Trishubha, Anushtabha. There's different meters. This is written in Ovid, which is entirely different world, and written in Marathi. So anyone that's Marathi could read it, and it was the first one of its kind. So Jnaneshwar wrote this text, and he was drenched in bhakti. Even though he's an Advaitic somewhat philosopher, his entire text is about bhakti of Krishna in the form of Vittala. So Vittala is Vittoba in Marathi, is it's also called Panduranga, is in this region in Maharashtra, which, interestingly enough, all the dasas within the Madhva tradition refer to Vitala, right? So Purandasa, all his songs end with Purandara Vitala. Every one of these dasas connect to the Vitala of the Maharashtra tradition. So Gyaneshwar was the first one to write a commentary, La Gita, in a non-Sanskrit language, connecting it to a particular tradition within Maharashtra, and then was able to create this tradition and religion that had no concern for Varna, Jati, women, man, none of that mattered again. All that mattered was the devotion to God and love of God. And his commentary on the Gita is beautiful. Gyaneshwar, if you get a chance, you should read it.
Yeah, and another thing worth mentioning here is he apparently wrote it before the age of 20, around the age of 16 or 17. So he was kind of a child prodigy. So we don't have firm evidence, but he seems to have taken sannyas quite early and seems to have left his life around 21 or 22. So that is also very remarkable. So in Maharashtra, if you come, he is a very revered figure in every household. So I can tell of the Brahmin households. So all the Brahmin households have the Jnaneshwari. So I have it in my house as well. So
I do too. It's my shelf right here, Gaurav.
Yeah,
I have it too.
It is one of the foundational texts, even of the Marathi language. His works, Jnaneshwari and Amrutanubhav. And he started the Varkari Sampradaya, which continues till date and is a very popular sect per se in Maharashtra. So annually we have this long pilgrimage, walking pilgrimage to Pandharpur. So other saints, Tukaram and Namdev, they followed Jnaneshwar. So it is like a colossal figure in Maharashtra, and it continues to shape the lives of people right until the day. So,
and there's been movies on it, and I've seen like the movies in Bollywood movies. I love the movies. If you ever get a chance to watch a movie, Gyaneshwar, it's in Hindi and it's amazing. I love it.
Yeah. So some of the compositions by him are also like a lot of his compositions are also been rendered musically. So it's a
and they're called abhangs, right? All these. Yeah. So within the Nath Sampradaya, there's many musical traditions that that come through abhangs. Like written by Gyaneshwar or his brother or his sisters or his descendants, so on. I mean, not his biological descendants, but his spiritual descendants. They're beautiful, beautiful songs, and all of them connect to nature. It's actually fascinating. They connect to nature and they connect to Vitala, right? So it's amazing.
Yeah, another figure we missed talking about in the Bhakti movement was another Marathi saint called Namdev. So he was also around this time contemporaries with Jnaneshwar, and there are some hagiographical descriptions of both of them meeting. So he was also an important saint, and he finds a lot of importance in the Guru Granth Sahib, in the Sikh tradition as well. So if you guys are aware, there is a large, not a large, but an important Sikh presence in Maharashtra. So a pilgrimage.
Nanded, right?
It's in Nanded. Yeah, in Nanded. So that is because of Namdev. So
couple more comments when we talk about religion in this period. Two things that we missed out. We discussed Gyaneshwar. There was also the Mahanubhava movement in Maharashtra around the same period, led by a figure named Chakradhara, who was, I think, of Gujarati origin, but much of his time was actually spent in Maharashtra. And his movement was very radical in the sense that it emphasized Krishna Bhakti to the extreme, and it completely disregarded caste, right? And it was extremely radical for its time and even for modern times, right? It is very different from, I would say, that the Tengalai Sampradaya, which Mukunda discussed. I think the Tengalais, while they were relatively more liberal than the Vadagalais, they still acknowledged caste, right? You still have caste among the Tengalais, but whereas in Mahanubhava Sampradaya, I think it's even more radical, right? And it leans towards monotheism, centered around Krishna, right? That's worth remarking. And the other thing we didn't mention is Shaivism in the Deep South. This holds true for the early part of this period, the growth of Shaiva Siddhanta. I know we discussed Shaiva Siddhanta in the earlier episode, but a couple of key figures that I would like to mention. Sekkiyar, who wrote the Periya Puranam, which basically outlines the lives of all of the Nayanars, an important Shaivite work. It was composed in the early part of this period, early 1100s, right? And it was actually critical in bringing Kulotunga Shola, was kind of flirting with Jainism back to the Shaiva fold. And Kulotunga actually ended up becoming a very ardent Shaivite, and he also led many persecutions against Vaishnavites, right? So Sekkiyar is an important figure, and Periya Puranam is an important classic of this period. And there's also Mekkandar, who is an extremely important figure and a theorist of Shaiva Siddhanta. He actually drew upon the older Sanskrit-based Shaiva Siddhanta texts from the north to develop Shaiva Siddhanta doctrine, which was very much rooted in the Tamil country, right? And his text is known as Shivajnana Bodham. It's in sutra form, and it has some interesting theory. I think it conceives of Shaivism in terms of Pati, Pashu, and Pasham, I think, right? So, I mean, I don't want to get into the details. Those who are interested can read up more on it.
Yeah, that's
right?
Right. It's similar to a lot of the Vishishta ideas of.
Right.
Though I think it's developed independently. So I don't want to say it's connected to it, but it's entirely independent. But it has,
right.
Pati Pashu.
I think Shaiva Siddhanta is more dualist than Vishishtadvaita. Vishishtadvaita is still monistic in the sense that it acknowledges that Atman and Brahman are essentially the same, of the same nature, right? I think that's one difference. There was also a Vishishtadvaitin philosophy within Shaivism, that is a Shrikantha Shaivism, right? Which I think later had a big influence on Appaya Dikshita, right? So the philosophy of Shrikantha is pretty much the philosophy of Ramanuja, except that the theology is centered on Shiva, right? And I think scholars have pointed out parallels even between Sri Bhashya and Shrikantha's Bhashya of the Brahma Sutras, right? Which is interesting, and it's probably worthy of more research. Yeah.
Right. So moving on, another pivotal figure of this era is Baswaraj.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Baswaraj. Shrikanth, you want to start with that?
Yeah, I think we touched upon that a little bit earlier. I think Veerashaivism predates Basavanna, right? And I think it has older origins, though I'm not particularly well read on the history of Veerashaivism. And I think it's a pan-Indian movement. But Basava was a person who, I think he was a courtier to one of the chieftains, I guess, in Western Chalukya heyday, right? And he was based in northern Karnataka. And his movement emphasized monotheism centered around Shiva. And it was very different from, say, Shaiva Siddhanta or Shrikantha's Shaivism in the Deep South, in the sense that it was very much extremely egalitarian in its orientation and explicitly anti-caste, which wouldn't necessarily be how you would think of Shaiva Siddhanta, which I would say is relatively more orthodox in that respect, right? His Lingayat movement continues to be very dominant, especially in Karnataka, right? And I think one of the texts that emerged in Basava's tradition is Basava Purana, authored by one of the disciples in his tradition, Somanatha, I think. And that was the text I referred to earlier in the call, right? Where non-Shaivas are referred to as Bhavis, right? And it's explicitly encouraged that Shaivas should not even talk to non-Shaivas, right? It's very aggressive. And that strain of Shaivism, it may have had an impact on certain polities of that period, especially in the Andhra territory. That's up for debate. I know Mukunda had slightly different views on that. But Basava's Lingayat tradition continues to be very dominant in Karnataka and to a lesser extent in Maharashtra and Andhra. Yeah.
Right.
Even
and
politically very, very relevant, if you have to say.
I mean, connected to Basavana was what her name was Akka Mahadevi, right? Akka Mahadevi was part of the tradition of Basavana. I think she was roughly around like 1140, 1130, something like that. She was within the tradition of Basavana, where she expressed utter total Madhurya Bhava with Shiva, right? In the sense of love with Shiva, constant engagement with Shiva. So much so to the fact that she had stripped herself naked in front of men of all different classes to show for her that none of this mattered. For her relationship was only with the one supreme being for her, which is Shiva, and nothing mattered outside from Shiva. She rejected like luxury. She rejected money. She was entirely devoted to Shiva. And then she was also, interesting enough, also a philosopher. And in some sense, I would say she was akin to something like Andal, right? Within the Sri Vaishnava tradition, where she did very similar behaviors, engagements with the divine that Andal did. And she also has, I think like 300 plus vachanas, which is what they call all the writings of Basavana and the traditional Lingayats called vachanas. And those, out of those vachanas, there's 300 attributed to Akka Mahadevi. She's huge in Karnataka region. And in many ways, she represents within the larger Indic world, the idea of female emancipation, much like Mirabai or Andal, through the divine, right? It's a sense of where if you are spiritually inclined, then the social mores and the restriction of the world don't apply to you anymore because you're beyond what these limitations are. And I think it's important to recognize that although most of us are men here discussing, we're talking about men, that there was a huge impact of women across the board. And maybe it's our fault that we don't know more about the women that did better.
Yeah. So just a small interjection. We also alluded to Rudrama Devi. So she was also a very important figure if you have to talk about women. So one of the earliest women sovereigns of the country, along with Razia Sultana. So just because we were talking about women in the spiritual aspect, I thought to mention her as well.
Sure. Now moving on, what about art and literature? Shrikanth, what are some of the literary texts that were prominent in this era and sort of still are read? And who were the writers, who were the authors?
Right. I think one text that really stands out, at least from the Tamil country for this period, is Kamban's Ramavataram. Right. It is an extremely important text. It is super popular in Tamil Nadu to this day. Right. It is, I think, the first rendering of Ramayanam in vernacular, if I'm not wrong. Right. And Kambar, I think, operated somewhere in the Chola territory. And this text was, I think, authored in the 1200s, early 1200s, if I'm not wrong. And it's still very popular. And it's not uncommon to see Kamban's Ramavataram on bookshelves of many people.
Or even the songs, like Kandain Sidi and Kandain Raghava, right?
Right.
It's a very famous song that's sung in Tamil Nadu, right? Right. Kamban.
Yeah, I know. I think that's a composition by Uttukudi Venkatakavi Iyer.
No. Kandain Sidi and Kandain Raghava is Kambans.
It's Kambans? Oh, okay. Maybe I'm wrong. Okay. Yeah. So that's an important text. And talking more broadly about literature, I would say this period, in the previous episode, we spoke a lot about Tamil and Kannada literature, right? The two older Dravidian languages. But this was the period when both Telugu and Malayalam emerged into their own, right? I mean, they kind of emerged as distinct literary languages, right? I'm sure they were spoken even in earlier times, but they emerged as major languages during this period. I think Malayalam emerged out of Tamil's shadow and became a distinct language. And Telugu, and we spoke of Nanaya earlier in the call, was followed by Tikkanna and Aranna, who are the three major Telugu poets who composed Mahabharatam in Telugu, right? And this was followed by further efflorescence of Telugu poetry during Vijayanagara times, which we can probably discuss in the next call, in the next episode, right? But Telugu did emerge as a major language in this period. Even Basava Purana, which we discussed a few minutes back, that was also a work in Telugu, right? So that's on literature. And there was a great deal of literature in Sanskrit too. I mean, we spoke about Vedanta Deshika, who is more famous as a philosopher, but he was also a great literary figure. He wrote Paduka Sahasram, Yadava Bhyudayam, which are acknowledged as literary masterpieces, right? There were also many Sandesha Kavyas along the lines of Kalidasa's Meghadutam in Kerala, right, which were also written in Sanskrit. So there was a great deal of literature in Sanskrit as well in the southern country. Yeah, that's on literature.
Someshwara, he wrote a book which on the cuisine and.
That's right. Yeah, and I think there's a good blog on this by Manasa Tarangini, worth looking up. Someshwara III. He was a Chalukyan king who I think succeeded his father Vikramaditya VI, right? He lived in the early 1100s or maybe mid 1100s, right? He ruled for a fairly long time. And Someshwara III wrote this text called Manasollasa. It's an encyclopedic work which covers many aspects of daily life, even things like idli, dosa, the early forms of these dishes. They are discussed in Someshwara's text, right? And of course, I've not read it. I don't know much Sanskrit. But I think I think the blogger Manasa Tarangini has written much on this particular text. There's one other text that's worth mentioning. I think that during the Yadava period, there was this person named Hemadri who wrote this text called Chaturvarga Dharma or something like that, which discusses the different vratas for the four varnas. Right? It's probably one of those early texts which discussed the religious obligations for all four classes, because generally these dharma texts are discussed from the standpoint of the Brahmana Varna. Right? This is a text which discusses religious observances for the broader society, if I'm not wrong. Chaturvarga Dharma, if I'm not, I think it was written by one of the Yadava scholars, Hemadri, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, I mean, in this period of time, you have quite a bit of the development of a lot of Dharma Shastra texts, right? So Devala, which is a commentator on the Manu Smriti, along with people who so in this period, you have actually development of both what's known as the commentary tradition and also the development of what's known as Nibandhas, right? The Nibandhas are full catalogs of the various statements and various ideas within the Dharma Shastra tradition. A lot of this was developed in the southern world, along with a lot of the commentaries. So, I mean, most people know the commentaries like Mitakshari or Diyabhaga, or there's a few other ones. So these are various commentaries on Dharma Shastras. So some people think the Mitakshari might have been written in the South India roughly around this time period. We don't know, but these are all over the place. So what you end up having is, in this time period, a really strong growth of ideas of what Dharma is, but also what Dharma, how it's practiced in different places. Like, for example, like Devala talks about how in the north, they have certain practices, but in the south, a practice that the North Indians won't do, which is the niece marrying the uncle, right? This is a tradition that's not allowed within the North Indian tradition. But within the South Indian tradition, it's allowed. but because it's practiced in the south, they say allow it to be practiced because it's dharma in that region. So dharma, what is termed dharma, shifts between what is practiced in certain places and how people accept it. So we get to deeper concepts of what dharma means in this time period than simply just, well, these are the rules, follow them. It actually becomes much more complicated in this time. So you have actually a large growth of literature in regards to dharma at this time.
Right. I just wanted to correct myself that the name of the text that I mentioned by Hemadri is Chaturvarga Chintamani. Right. Yeah. I know we're probably nearing the end of this episode. I thought I should quickly talk about mathematics as well, right? When we discuss this period from 1100 to 1400, one major figure from this period is Bhaskaracharya, Maharashtrian mathematician of Deshastha origins, right? Who wrote this great text, Siddhanta Shiromani, right? Which discusses many early ideas of calculus, right? So it's a very influential text. And also the Kerala school of mathematics has its origins in this period. So the great Kerala mathematician, Madhava of Sangamagrama, right? Who lived near Thrissur, he actually belongs to the 14th century. So I know when we think of Kerala school of mathematics, we think of people like Jeshtadeva, Narayana Bhattacharya, who lived much later, right, in 15th, 16th centuries. But the founding figure of this tradition, Madhava of Sangramagrama, actually belongs to the 14th century. Very much belongs to this period. And Madhava was a very important figure who pioneered in infinite series. So all of us have learned the formula for pi, right? In school, so pi by 4 is equal to 1 minus 1 by 3 plus 1 by 5 minus 1 by... So that is actually there in Madhava's text. I don't think Madhava's own writings have survived. His disciples have attributed that to Madhava, right? So this is a 14th century discovery of the pi infinite series, which was later independently discovered, I think, by Leibniz, right? And Madhava's work also has many ideas with respect to calculus, which predate Newton and Leibniz by a few centuries, right? So I know we can discuss Kerala school of mathematics even in a subsequent episode, but its origins are very much in this period. And the most important figure of that school, Madhava, belongs to this period.
Right. What about temple architecture? We discussed in the earlier episode that this is the time, especially during the Chola reign, temples really were these huge architectural marvels.
Yeah, I know we discussed Brihadishwara and other Chola temples in the earlier episode. One major Chola temple which is actually constructed in this period is actually the Airavateshwara temple at Dharashuram near Kumbakonam, right? That was actually constructed in the late 1100s, right? I think Rajadiraja II, or I forget the name of the king, right? That belongs to this period. But when we think of temples, I think the temple architecture that really stands out in this period is the Hoysala temple architecture at Belur and Halebeed and also Somnathpura, right? Those are exquisite temples and they seem to have survived all the raids on Dwarasamudra and Halebeed by Malik Kafur and others, right? They seem to have survived fairly intact. And those are pretty exquisite temples, and they are located in the Hasan district of Karnataka today, right? There were also temples constructed by the Kakatiyas in Warangal, right? The Ramappa temple, Hanamkonda, right? Which still survives. But those are not major pilgrimage centers today, unlike the temples in the Tamil country, right? And of course, we should mention Srirangam and Madurai, especially Srirangam, much of which was actually reconstructed in this period after the raids by Malik Kafur and Ulugh Khan, right? The early Vijayanagara kings did contribute, and even the Pandyas, right? They did contribute to the construction of the Srirangam temple, and also the early Vijayanagara kings like Kumara Kampanna. As I mentioned, worship in the Srirangam temple was disrupted for 3 or 4 decades before it was restored in late 14th century by Kumara Kampanna, who defeated the Madurai Sultanate. Yeah.
Right. Right.
If I'm not mistaken, I think some of the famous Jyotirlings are also from this period. So
Possibly, yeah.
yeah, maybe Mukunda or Shrikanth no more, but yeah.
Right. Any final thoughts? Any comments on the legacy of this era? What is it? What features of our daily lives in India owe their origin to this period? Any rituals, any practices,
Yeah.
any popular cultural motives?
Yeah, so I'll just go first. So one important thing, like especially I come from Maharashtra, so the religious things which we follow today are either go back to this time or they go back to the Maratha Empire, the time of the Maratha Empire. So the Bhakti movement has a drastic impact on Maharashtra. So, for example, if you see the statistics of vegetarianism, so a lot of the people who are followers of the Varkari Sampradaya are vegetarians. So that has a lot of cultural legacy even today. So, and this goes across all castes. So across the castes, the vegetarianism, people say goes back to the Varkari Sampradaya and their religious motive. So another way maybe we can look at it as how the resistance to the Islamic rule came through. So one of the things possibly can go back to the popularization of the religious motives among the masses. So how the masses connected with the larger Hindu ethos, so to speak. And that is given as seen in scholarship as one of the reasons why the popular uprisings were possible. So in the long history arc, if we look, Hinduism remains one of the only remaining pagan or polytheistic traditions. So maybe some people like to say that the Bhakti movement, which was from this time, had a major role to play with that. So maybe I'll like Shrikanth and Mukunda's comments on that as well.
One thing that I'd like to mention as an important legacy, which we didn't mention, maybe we'll discuss more of this when we get to Vijayanagara Empire, because the rise of Vijayanagara very much belongs to this period, right? The Vijayanagara Empire kingdom established in the 1340s, right? I think it's a very pivotal moment in Indian history, because if you look at the Deccan in the 1320s and 30s, when Ulugh Khan had managed to subdue all the four major kingdoms, Hoysalas, Kakatiyas, Yadavas, right? Much of the Deccan was under Tughlaq influence, right? And at that point, the Hindu resistance in those years, the 20 to 30 year period that followed, was crucial in recovering much of that territory back into the Hindu fold, so to speak. And the reality of pan-Indian Muslim rule, it never materialized until maybe Aurangzeb's time, right? So pan-Indian Muslim rule could have been a reality in 14th century itself, had that Hindu resistance not materialized in mid-14th century, right? And had that happened in the mid-14th century, India would probably be a very different place, even demographically today, right? If you imagine South India with 25% Muslim population as opposed to single digit, right? It has very different implications of how things would have panned out in 1947, how the boundaries would have been drawn, right? So I think that the Hindu resistance of the 14th century did play a big role in how India shaped up eventually.
Right. Mukunda, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I mean, if you're asking how much the impact in this period was on all of us, I think depends on who you are and where you're from. I think across the board, the Bhakti movement from that kind of started in this period of time has affected every single person across India. But if you're asking about our daily rituals, I think it depends. Like Madhwas, True Vaishnavites, Lingaites, we clearly have our origins in this time period. Smartas maybe earlier. From Shankara and so on. So I do think like this is the problem with history. It's all important at all times, at all points, right? It all connects, right? It's a cause and effect. So I think it's vitally important to all of us, and it just behooves us to learn more.
Right.
Right.
So
the
I'll sort of end the episode on
just to end, the devotional aspects of Hinduism, which we take for granted today, they may have not been that popular before this time, which we take for granted. So that is.
I'm not going to say that. So I will push back on that. I think the devotional aspects were clearly there from the get-go.
Among the masses, I mean to say.
No, I think they were still there in the masses. I think the difference would be like how much of a priority they were given in the world that they existed in, right? Like the text, whether you look at the Puranas that were developed in the Gupta period, there's devotion like no one's business, right? They talk about it all the time. But I think the issue comes down to is how did it affect our lives day to day? And I think these movements and the Bhakti movement, what they did is popularize and make it more accessible was already there. And that was tougher to get because maybe some of this was in Sanskrit, right? People couldn't read the Puranas in Sanskrit, so they had to learn it in Tamil or Marathi or Kannada or Telugu or whatever it is. So I think this popularization of these ideas came in this period of time.
Right. So we'll wrap up this episode on a personal note. So if you ever come to Gurgaon next, there is a restaurant called Carnatic Cafe. And that Carnatic Cafe restaurant, when you sit on it, you can look at the Google office and you can have an idli, the recipe of which goes back to this age. And the restaurant plays the bhajans of Purandara Dasa. So
unless they have Bisi Bela Bhat, it's not a Karnataka restaurant.
So you can actually have food whose recipe goes back to this era. You can actually listen to bhajans whose origins go back to this era.
Yeah, just
while you're working for Google.
Just one clarification, Maneesh. Purandara Dasa doesn't belong to this era. The tradition he belongs to.
The tradition belongs to this era. Yes, Purandara Dasa obviously comes from 15th century, 16th century. But the tradition. Right. So my point is, in India, when you say you literally live in multiple centuries, I know it sounds like a cliche and a very motherhood statement, but there is some grain of truth to it, right?
Yes.
Right.
And the words of Purandara Dasa to everyone else, Hari Smarane Madho Nirantara. That's all.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. This has been lovely.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.